Get that feeling. Like there are these places or stories that kind of exist, just at the edge of what we normally think about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like they're there, but not really in the forefront, right?
Right. That's exactly what happened to me when I started looking at this material on Nagaland. It's fascinating, but also kind of disturbing. The source we're diving into today paints a picture of this region in India, a place that's been allegedly kept isolated and under really heavy military control for, well, it seems like decades from what they're saying.
Right away, it raises some pretty serious questions about what's actually been going on there for so long and why we might not be hearing more about it.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive. This source is very critical of how India has dealt with Nagaland, almost like it's revealing a secret history that most people don't know about.
That's a good way to put it, a hidden chapter.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this so compelling to explore.
Totally. So, where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, I think the core of this source's argument comes down to a few key questions, and these are the ones we're going to try to grapple with today.
All right, lay them on me.
First and foremost, why would Nagaland be kept isolated for so long, assuming that's true? Second, what's the reason for the intense military presence that the source describes? And finally, why would there be this apparent fear, at least according to this source, of a Nagaland that's well-informed, connected, and united?
Yeah, those are some heavy questions. Okay, so let's jump right in. The source starts off by talking about this idea of deliberate isolation. They're really not mincing words here, claiming that there was a media blackout on Nagaland that lasted for decades, no national news coverage, they say, and even restrictions on people visiting the region.
It paints a picture of a very controlled environment, doesn't it? Like someone was actively trying to keep Nagaland out of sight and out of mind.
That's exactly the impression I got. They even mentioned that outsiders historically needed special permission, like permits, just to enter Nagaland. It's not something you usually see within a country.
Right. And that's where it gets interesting. Because the source doesn't just describe this isolation, they try to explain the why.
Okay, so what's their take on that?
Well, they're pretty straightforward about it. They argue that this was a deliberate strategy by the Indian government in Delhi. They say it was about preventing the Naga people from questioning their place within India, from even having the information to think about alternatives.
That's a bold claim, like controlling the narrative to maintain control.
Absolutely. And we've seen this kind of thing throughout history, right? Controlling information flow, especially in regions where there's tension or a desire for autonomy, is a powerful way to maintain power.
It makes you think about all the things we might not know just because the information was never available.
Exactly. So then we have to ask, if that's true, what were they trying to hide?
Well, that brings us to a really crucial point in the source. They highlight this historical event that kind of reframes everything. Nagaland's Declaration of Independence back on August 14th, 1947.
Oh, wow. So that was a day before India declared its own independence.
Yeah, a day before. And that really makes you pause, right? Like, we usually think of Indian independence as this unified moment, but this suggests a very different story was unfolding in Nagaland.
Right. It challenges that whole narrative. And the source argues that India's response to Nagaland's declaration was not one of negotiation or recognition, but of force.
So they're saying that India basically said no to a peaceful declaration of independence.
That's what the source argues, yes. They say that instead of engaging with Nagaland's aspirations, the Indian government moved in with military force, shut down any voices that disagreed with them, and essentially tried to erase that declaration from history.
Which I guess then makes the whole media blackout thing even more suspicious, right?
Exactly. The source explicitly asks, was this lack of coverage about keeping a lid on what was happening in Nagaland, about preventing the rest of the country from knowing that there was this whole other story going on? It definitely suggests that there was something to hide.
Okay, so they declare independence, India allegedly responds with force, and then we enter what this source calls the Forgotten Wars of Nagaland.
Yeah, and this is where things get pretty intense, because the source describes armed resistance by groups like the Naga National Council, or the NNC.
Okay, so these were groups that were actively fighting for an independent Nagaland.
Yes, and later on, another group emerged, the NSCN, the National Socialist Council of Nagaland. They were fighting for the same goal, independence for their homeland. And according to the source, the Indian government's response was a full-on military crackdown.
And they're not holding back on the accusations here. They talk about entire villages being burned, widespread torture of civilians, even rape and killings. It's a very grim picture they paint.
It is, and they emphasize that these alleged atrocities were largely unreported in the rest of India. Like, it was happening, but no one outside Nagaland was really aware of it, or at least that's what the source claims.
And they blame that, at least in part, on the AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act.
Right, that's a very controversial piece of legislation. It basically gives the military a huge amount of power in areas declared as disturbed, and the source argues that this created a climate where soldiers could act with impunity.
So even if those awful things did happen, the source is saying that the soldiers involved were essentially protected from facing consequences.
That's the claim, yes. Which then leads to the really unsettling question. Why weren't these events, if true, being reported? Why was there this alleged silence around what was happening in Nagaland?
And the source has a theory about that, right?
They do. They suggest that the Indian government feared a domino effect. If Nagaland succeeded in breaking away, they were worried that other states in the Northeast, many of which also have unique cultures and histories, might try to do the same thing.
So they're saying that it wasn't just about controlling Nagaland, it was about preventing the whole idea of separatism from spreading.
Exactly. And their argument is that instead of addressing the root causes of this discontent, the government resorted to force and information control to try to hold everything together.
So, fast forward to today, and the source claims that Nagaland is still heavily militarized, even now. They even talk about this underground government that operates within Nagaland. It's a pretty mind-blowing concept.
Right, like a whole parallel system of governance existing within another country's borders. They say this underground government collects taxes, makes laws, the whole 9 yards. It really makes you wonder what everyday life in Nagaland is actually like.
Yeah, and they tie this into the ongoing demand for what they call Greater Nagalim. They describe it as a nightmare for India.
Oh, so it's not just about Nagaland as it exists now.
No. Greater Nagalim is about uniting all Naga people across multiple states, including parts of Manipur, Assam, and Arunachal Pradesh. And from what the source is saying, that's something the Indian government definitely doesn't want to see happen.
It's definitely a very complex geopolitical situation. And it makes you wonder, why would Delhi still be so concerned about Nagaland? Especially if, as they claim, it's always been an integral part of India.
That's the big question the source raises. They suggest that maybe this fear is about something else entirely. They float a couple of possibilities. Maybe it's about covering up those alleged war crimes from the past, things that could be exposed if Nagaland gained more autonomy. Or maybe it's about control over Nagaland's resources, which, from what I've read, include things like oil, uranium, and other valuable minerals.
Like, what's the real motivation here? Is it about protecting national unity? Or is there something else going on?
And then the source throws out what they call the biggest question of all, and this one really stopped me in my tracks. They say, if Nagaland has always been considered part of India, then why has India repeatedly made peace agreements with the Naga insurgents over the years?
That's a good point. Why negotiate with groups that are fighting for independence if you don't see them as having any legitimate claim?
Exactly. The source concludes that these peace talks are proof that Delhi knows that Nagaland was never truly a part of India. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. But it does make you think about how we define things like nationhood and belonging.
So towards the end, the source turns its attention to the future. They leave us with a bunch of really tough questions. Will India ever acknowledge the harm, what they call mistakes, that were done in Nagaland? Will the Naga people ever get justice for what they went through? And is this cycle of silence, suppression, and resistance just going to keep going on forever? It's a heavy way to end things, for sure.
It is, but those are questions we can't just ignore, right?
Well,
Like, what does the future hold for Nagaland?
right, and the source is adamant about one thing. Nagaland will not be forgotten again. They say we need to keep talking about this, keep asking these questions.
That's a powerful message. This is a story that deserves to be heard and understood.
Okay, so we've gone through this source, and I've got to say, it's really made me think. I mean, some of those concluding questions are still rattling around in my head.
Oh, yeah, me too. Like, where do we even begin to answer them?
Exactly. Should Nagaland be its own country? Should India apologize for what happened there? And what about that idea of a hidden agenda, something beyond what we're being told? This source lays out a very specific perspective, a critical one.
It does. It asks us to question some pretty fundamental things, like what makes a nation? What happens when different groups within a country have different visions for the future? And how do we deal with historical injustices?
Like, how do we reconcile these different perspectives, these different versions of history?
Yeah, and how do we move forward in a way that's fair and just for everyone involved?
Mm.
That's the real challenge, and there are no easy answers.
I guess that's what makes this so important to discuss, because as the source